The iPad Pro 2020 has been out for a couple of months now, and I've had mine for around 6 weeks. This is 8 reasons to buy one and 2 not to. But before we get into why you should or shouldn't buy an iPad Pro, let's have a look at the specs. The iPad Pro 2020 comes in an 11-inch and a 12.9-inch screen, features a 120Hz ProMotion display, storage starts at 128GB at the low end, and you can spec one up to have up to a terabyte of storage, if you can stomach the price. It has the latest and greatest A12Z Bionic chip, and all models come with 6 gigs of RAM. There's a 7-megapixel front-facing true depth camera and dual rear-facing cameras on the back, a 12-megapixel wide and a 10-megapixel ultra-wide. It also has a LiDAR scanner. Audio comes from 4 speakers positioned 1 in each corner, and it has a stated battery life of around 10 hours. So here's what I like about the iPad Pro 2020. Number 1, the form factor. The form factor of the 2020 iPad Pro is hands down my favourite they have ever produced. It's very reminiscent of the design of the iPhone 5, 5S and SE models, which was one of my favourite iPhone designs of all time. With its square edges and rounded corners, fingers crossed the iPhone 12 is going to follow this same design aesthetic. The perfectly equal and slim, for an iPad at least, bezels around the display are so satisfying to my eyes. And before you go crazy down in the comments, yes, it is the same as the 2018 iPad Pro, but I haven't got one of those to compare it to, so this is the first time I've experienced it in the flesh. But we'll get to that later. To me, the comparison is with this. This is an iPad Air first generation. It's 6.5 years old. So the bezels on this thing, they're not equal, and they're not slim. If you're new to iPad Pro, there are a few things missing from previous models. Number 1, no more home button. This has of course been disappearing from Apple devices for some time. Number 2, something I hadn't actually noticed until I had the iPad in my hands, there's no more side switch to control the mute or lock rotation. In fact, there's no current iPad model that has a side switch anymore. I'm interested to know, having not bought an iPad in a while, when did Apple get rid of the side switch? And am I the last person to notice? Let me know down in the comments if you too didn't realise that the side switch had disappeared, or you've known for ages and it's just me that's not noticed. The iPad Pro is also the beginning of the end for a completely flush camera on the back of the device, or at least from the 2018 model onwards. The iPad Pro features a camera bump, and this year it's even bigger. But I guess we're all used to camera bumps at this point, and it's a necessary evil. Camera bumps aside, the design really speaks to me. And nearly 7 years down the line, I don't think the iPad Pro will look nearly as dated as the iPad Air does now. Number 2, USB-C. With the help of the iPad Pro 2020, the USB devices in my house have reached tipping point. USB-C is now in the majority, so charging devices in my house is far more universal. The USB-C port in the iPad Pro allows you to charge the device, connect external monitors, as well as other accessories like external hard drives. If you connect a USB-C dongle, you can do all of these things at the same time. This is something that the Lightning port can only really do one at a time. And you're going to need a specific dongle for each application. That's where the iPad Pro really is streets ahead of the other models. Number 3, the display. The 120Hz ProMotion display on the iPad Pro is one of the main reasons it feels so snappy. Animations are smooth, scrolling is great, and it just looks amazing. In fact, next to my 2016 MacBook Pro, the screen on the iPad Pro looks so much sharper and brighter. It's also a laminated display, meaning the glass is bonded to the display itself, unlike on some of the lower models. This means you don't get that air gap now between the glass that you're touching and the display underneath, like on this first generation iPad Air. Number 4, the Apple Pencil. Using the Apple Pencil 2nd generation on the iPad Pro is a pleasure. Charging the Pencil now makes complete sense and is something that you don't really have to think about. The matte textured finish is tactile and grippy, and the pencil itself is much lighter than I expected. It feels similar to using a high quality mechanical pencil. Accuracy of the pencil is brilliant, and palm rejection is well implemented and very consistent. It also features a double tap gesture which can be configured in the settings to a couple of different actions, or you can in fact, like me, turn it off altogether. I think there's still some potential to increase the overall usefulness of this feature, and that's why for now mine remains turned off. If you're thinking about getting an iPad Pro for art or illustration, you will not be disappointed. Number 5, Sidecar. Sidecar is an iPad OS feature, so it's available on other models, more on that later, that allows you to use your iPad as a second monitor, either wired or wirelessly on compatible Macs. Just think about that for a second. You now have a super slim, lightweight, portable second screen for your Mac that also doubles as an iPad. This is my favourite iPad OS feature and I use it all the time. Number 6, mouse and trackpad support. Mouse support is something that iPad users have been asking for years, and finally it's been added, and not just as an accessibility feature but as a full-blown feature. You can connect almost any Bluetooth mouse or trackpad to your iPad and control it just like a laptop. Ish. One mouse that doesn't work is this, Apple's first generation Magic Mouse. Seems a little strange, but there it is. This is the one that has separate batteries and not that stupid lightning charger that means you can't use it while it's charging. This is the one to have, but it doesn't work with the iPad. The implementation of mouse support I actually think is very clever. The cursor kind of snaps into place as you hover over buttons, making missed clicks far less likely. And although this hasn't been implemented in all apps yet, I'm sure it won't be long. Number 7, longevity. The cost of the iPad Pro 2020 may seem astronomical in comparison to lower end models, but because of the power of the A12Z Bionic chip, you will be able to hold on to this model much further into the future, especially when you consider how long Apple is prepared to carry on supporting its devices. This iPad Air only became obsolete with the release of iOS 13. And many of the most common apps like Netflix and YouTube still work fine, if a little slow. Number 8, iPad OS. Whilst I've mentioned some of the individual features in their own right already on the list, iPad OS is the main reason people are once again looking at the iPad to become their main computing device. iPad OS is of course available on other iPad models, in fact all the current iPad models as well as a couple of the older models. But the iPad Pro is where iPad OS really shows its potential. Running multiple applications at once and switching between them on the iPad Pro makes it feel more like a laptop than ever before. There are far too many features to go through in this video, so let me know down in the comments if that's something that you'd be interested in. So that's what I like about the iPad Pro 2020, but what don't I like? Number 1, Face ID. This is a bit more picky, but in the time that I've had the iPad Pro, I've found that the addition of Face ID is good, but not great. Face ID doesn't lend itself to the iPad in the same way that it does to the iPhone. In my house, there's more than one of us that use the iPad. At the moment, only I have my face set up for Face ID. So if my partner so much as picks it up to hand it to me, Face ID picks up her face, realizes it's not me, and it counts as a false attempt. By the time it's in my hands, I have to enter the passcode anyway. The requirement for the passcode to be entered is far higher than on the iPhone. And I don't know if this is because of failed attempts like the scenario I just mentioned or something else, but that's what seems to be happening. Face ID also requires you to be in a fairly specific position for it to read your face. When you're using your iPhone, this is a fairly natural position. You're gonna kind of hold it up to your face to look at your phone. But with the iPad, it's in a far wider range of positions. It might be propped up on a table, down on a desk surface. You end up kind of doing this bent over face presentation situation to get Face ID to work. I do, however, appreciate the change it's made to the device aesthetically. Number 2, the smart cover. Ever since the inception of the iPad, Apple has offered a smart cover. The concept has always been the same. It's a rigid cover for the screen that wakes and sleeps the device when you open it and close it. The design, however, over the years has been messed around with. The first version, in my opinion the best version, had a metal hinge and was split into 4 sections. The good thing about the design is because it was split into 4 sections, when you folded it back on itself, 2 of the surfaces overlapped and magnetically attached to each other. This gave you a much sturdier standing position. It was also available in leather. As the iPad shrunk, so did the cover, meaning it had to be split into 3 sections in order to still work. Gone was the metal hinge in favour of a polyurethane one. I should point out the metal hinge did leave a little wear mark on my original iPad, but they could have fixed that with some softer material on the inside of the hinge. It was also from this point on that you could no longer get the smart cover in leather, which I think is a shame. Fast forward to the iPad Pro 2020 and the smart cover is now called the Smart Folio Case, and it covers the whole of the device, back and front. Good for scratch protection and removal of the camera bump, bad for adding additional thickness and spoiling the overall design. The problem I have though, despite returning to a larger form factor because the device has got larger with the bigger screen, the cover is still split into 3 sections, which just isn't as stable as it could be. The case doesn't give you the confidence that the iPad's not going to fall over when it's propped up. And that's really all I'm asking for from the case. So those are the negatives of the iPad Pro 2020. But in true Apple fashion, there's one more thing. iPad Pro 2018. One of the biggest reasons not to buy the iPad Pro 2020 is the iPad Pro 2018. Whilst I've never actually used one myself, it's fairly obvious there's little to choose between the 2 devices. If you already have the 2018 version, I can't see much point in you upgrading to the 2020 version. And if you're in the market for an iPad Pro, you might get a bargain on a 2018 version. If, like me, you're coming from an older generation, regardless of whether you buy the 2018 or the 2020 version, you are going to see a massive improvement. And maybe getting the latest and greatest is going to give you the most longevity into the future. So what's the overall verdict? The iPad Pro 2020 is expensive, but the computing power it contains is equivalent to or better than many laptops. With the advancement of iPad OS and the addition of mouse and trackpad support, the question of whether iPad Pro can replace your laptop really comes down to what do you want to use your laptop for and how much you want it to. The iPad Pro offers much of what you would get out of a MacBook in terms of daily tasks, but might be the only way you're going to get a touchscreen on a Mac. The iPad doesn't yet boast the amount of professional apps that a laptop does, but with full versions of Office 365 and Adobe's push for a full version of Photoshop and Illustrator, it won't be long before it does. And rumour has it, Final Cut for the iPad is just round the corner. The iPad Pro 2020 is the best iPad you can get, but whether it's the iPad you should get really depends on you. For me, I think it's well worth the money, and I can only see it taking over more and more of my daily computing tasks. And that's regardless of whether you think it is or isn't a computer. If you like this video, then give me a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you would like more of this type of content, then hit that subscribe button. While you're down there, why not hit the bell? Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next one.